The sky above the small New Mexico desert town burned with an eerie brilliance that night. What had begun as a quiet evening with locals gathered at diners or tucked away in their homes ended with the heavens erupting into chaos. A fiery streak arced across the atmosphere, drawing every pair of eyes skyward. It wasn't a meteor, though it moved like one. Something about its trajectory felt wrong, purposeful, as if it were being pulled down by more than just gravity. Dr. Elias Grayson stood on his back porch, a tumbler of scotch in one hand, staring at the light show. The news had warned of a possible deorbiting of the International Space Station earlier that day, but reassurances were given. Controlled re-entries, they said. Minimal risk to life on the ground. Looking at the blazing fragments carving the night into shards of fire, Elias doubted those reassurances had been worth much. As the ISS disintegrated in the sky, one fragment stood out, a fiery core hurtling with terrifying precision. It burned brighter than the rest and descended faster, an unnatural trajectory as though something aboard was guiding its descent. Moments later, the horizon lit up with a distant flash. A low rumble followed, shaking Elias's house, making the windows tremble in their frames. The town's power flickered. In the sudden darkness, Elias muttered under his breath, "This can't be good." The next morning, news of the crash was everywhere. Reporters speculated about falling debris. Interviews with shaken locals who had seen the descent aired on repeat, and military officials issued vague reassurances about ongoing recovery operations. The fragment had fallen into the barren stretches of the Jornada del Muerto Desert, a place with no population and little vegetation, minimizing potential damage. Or so they said. Elias, a virologist by trade and a skeptic by nature, watched the coverage with growing unease. His career in infectious disease research had taught him that when officials downplayed a disaster, the truth was always uglier. Years earlier, he had been part of the failed global response to a deadly pathogen, a failure that still haunted him. The government's controlled tone reminded him of the early stages of that crisis. Misinformation, deflection, containment. His instincts told him something wasn't adding up. His suspicions were confirmed that evening when a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up outside his home. Two men in nondescript suits introduced themselves as government contractors but didn't bother offering specifics. They handed him a folder marked with a red classified stamp and instructed him to pack his things. A helicopter waited at the nearby airport. "You've been selected," one of the men said, his voice devoid of warmth or explanation. "Your expertise is needed. This is a matter of national security." Elias considered protesting but thought better of it. Years in government-funded research had taught him to recognize the signs. Non-negotiable summonses meant big problems. Big problems meant a chance to redeem himself or to be the next scapegoat. The journey into the desert was uneventful, the helicopter slicing through the twilight sky as Elias studied the folder in his lap. The sparse documentation inside made little sense. Photographs of a biosecure capsule retrieved from the crash site, notes about non-terrestrial origins, and a briefing stamped with the insignia of the Department of Defense. When they landed, Elias was escorted to a makeshift laboratory hastily assembled inside a military tent. The air was heavy with the stench of burnt metal and something far fouler, a sulfuric tang that clung to the back of his throat. The capsule sat at the center of the lab, a sleek, oblong container made of polished metal, its surface scorched black by re-entry. Despite the damage, it was intact, a miracle considering the ISS's catastrophic descent. "What am I looking at?" Elias asked no one in particular. One of the attending scientists, a pale, nervous man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, stepped forward. "We believe it's a sample from the ISS's classified Enceladus research program, some kind of microbial life they brought back from the ice. The sample was supposed to remain in microgravity indefinitely to prevent contamination. But, well, here we are." Elias frowned, his gaze locked on the capsule. "And why do you need me?" The scientist hesitated before answering. "Because the team that opened it yesterday, well, we lost contact with them. And when we sent a retrieval crew, they what?" Elias demanded. "They didn't come back." Elias's first look at the contents of the capsule left him speechless. Inside, beneath layers of protective seals, were clusters of translucent, gelatinous sacs. They pulsed faintly, as though something alive stirred within. Each sac glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, emitting an almost imperceptible hum that Elias felt more than heard. "They're not microbes," he murmured. "This is something else." "What kind of something?" one of the soldiers standing guard asked. "Something that shouldn't exist." Elias spent hours running tests. The sacs resisted every form of analysis. No DNA, no RNA, no recognizable biological markers. They absorbed light strangely, refracting it in patterns that gave Elias headaches if he stared too long. When he tried to pierce one with a needle, the sac shifted, almost as if it were avoiding the puncture. It wasn't solid, wasn't liquid, wasn't anything he could define. By midnight, exhaustion overtook him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I need more time." The soldier guarding the tent shrugged. "Time might be the one thing we don't have, Doc." The scream woke him. Elias stumbled out of the makeshift bunk he had been given and rushed back to the lab. Inside, chaos reigned. Equipment lay smashed on the floor, blood smeared across the walls. One of the lab technicians was convulsing on the ground, his eyes rolled back, veins bulging black against his pale skin. His body arched unnaturally, bones cracking as his limbs twisted in directions human joints weren't meant to go. "Stay back!" one of the soldiers shouted, aiming his rifle. But before he could fire, the technician stopped convulsing. His head snapped forward, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. A wet gurgle escaped his throat, followed by something else, something long, thin, and writhing. A tendril of translucent flesh slithered out of his mouth, tipped with a barb-like appendage. Elias stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. The soldier fired, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The technician's body jerked and collapsed, motionless. The tendril, however, continued to move, retreating into the shadows before anyone could stop it. "What the hell was that?" Elias whispered. No one had an answer. That night, as Elias lay awake in his bunk, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sacs in the capsule were pulsing faster, like a heartbeat quickening in anticipation. Elias stared at the fluorescent-lit hospital corridor, his fingers trembling against the stainless steel clipboard. The walls around him buzzed with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional hum of overhead lights. A nurse stood beside him, pale and visibly shaken. "It's room 314, she whispered, as though speaking the number too loudly might awaken something. Her wide eyes darted to the closed door at the end of the hall. "You have to see it." Elias nodded but said nothing. The clipboard in his hands detailed the patient's condition: severe fever, skin discoloration, erratic behavior. The file left out what the nurse had described in hushed tones over the phone just hours ago: features elongating, limbs moving independently of joints, and a voice that no longer sounded human. He stepped into the room, his breath catching as he saw the patient. The man, identified as a construction worker who had collapsed in a grocery store earlier that day, was strapped to the bed. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. His skin was a blotchy, sickly gray, and black veins snaked along his neck and temples, pulsating in grotesque rhythm. His eyes flickered open and shut, but when they stayed open long enough, Elias noticed something horrifying. His pupils weren't round. They were fracturing, splitting apart like cracked glass. "Doctor," the man wheezed, his voice a wet gurgle. "Help me." The plea sent a chill down Elias's spine. He approached cautiously, pulling on a pair of gloves as the nurse hovered near the doorway, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Elias leaned in to examine the man's face. "What are you feeling?" Elias asked, keeping his voice steady. The man's lips twitched into a grotesque grin, exposing teeth stained with black ichor. "It's not mine anymore." "What isn't yours?" "My head," the man whispered. His neck jerked violently, muscles straining against the straps. "My thoughts aren't mine." The room felt colder. Elias noted the erratic twitching of the man's fingers, the way his knuckles cracked as if something inside his hands was rearranging. As he prepared to take a blood sample, the man convulsed violently, arching his back until Elias was certain his spine would snap. Then he let out a guttural scream, his jaw unhinging far wider than any human anatomy should allow. Elias stumbled backward as something emerged from the man's throat. A slick, rope-like tendril tipped with jagged barbs. It lashed wildly, spraying a mist of dark fluid across the walls. The nurse screamed, bolting from the room. Elias scrambled to the far corner, his heart pounding as the man convulsed again, the tendril retreating back into his throat. The man collapsed, limp and silent. Elias's breathing was ragged as he edged toward the bed. The man's chest rose and fell weakly now, and the black veins had spread to his forearms and legs. Elias glanced at the heart monitor. It beeped erratically, then flatlined. For a brief moment, Elias thought it was over. Then the body moved. The man's head twisted toward Elias, his fractured pupils glowing faintly in the dim light. The movement was wrong, slow and deliberate, like a predator watching its prey. The grin returned, impossibly wide this time, splitting the corners of his mouth. "You don't understand," the voice rasped, no longer his own. It carried a strange cadence, as though multiple voices spoke at once. "We are becoming." The corpse lunged, snapping the straps as easily as paper. Elias ducked, narrowly avoiding the clawed hand that swiped toward him. The man, or what remained of him, moved with terrifying speed, unnatural grace animating his mangled body. The door burst open and 2 security officers stormed in, shouting warnings. They fired their tasers and the body spasmed, collapsing to the floor. But even as it lay twitching, Elias could see it wasn't truly defeated. The black veins pulsed, the fractured pupils still glinting with a horrifying awareness. By the time Elias returned home that night, the encounter replayed endlessly in his mind. He poured himself a drink, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of what he had seen. The organism from the capsule, it had to be connected. The way the tendril emerged, the black ichor, the fractured pupils. It was as if the infection wasn't just altering the body, it was rewriting it. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. It was another nurse from the hospital. Her voice was frantic. "Doctor Grayson, we have more cases coming in. It's not just the man in 314. There's a woman in the ER. Her arms. Oh God, her arms are splitting open." "How many?" Elias asked, already knowing the answer would be worse than he wanted to hear. "Half a dozen so far," she said. "But it's spreading. People in the waiting room, they're starting to act strange." Elias felt his stomach drop. The organism had escaped containment. It was airborne. The realization sent a wave of panic through him, but another thought clawed its way to the forefront of his mind. This isn't just an infection. It's intelligent. As dawn approached, Elias sat at his desk, poring over the patient notes and analyzing blood samples under a microscope. The cells of the infected were unrecognizable, their structure breaking down and reforming into something alien. They weren't just infected, they were becoming something else, something more. And worse, he began to notice something strange in himself. His thoughts felt fragmented, as though pieces of his mind were slipping away, replaced by whispers he couldn't quite understand. Elias sat in the dimly lit research facility, the cold blue glow of monitors casting shadows across the room. Outside, the world was unraveling. Reports of violent outbreaks flooded the news, but the broadcasts grew shorter with each passing hour. The infected were spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Cities were being abandoned, barricades overrun, and communication lines silenced. The room smelled of sweat and antiseptic. Elias had spent days without sleep, poring over data from samples he had retrieved before the hospital fell. His hands shook as he jotted down notes, not from fear, but from the slow, creeping realization that he was losing time. Minutes, hours, entire stretches of thought felt as though they were slipping through his fingers. Sometimes he'd look down and find pages of notes, scrawled in his own handwriting, but he had no memory of writing them. A knock at the door startled him. It was sharp, deliberate. He froze. Visitors were rare now, and unannounced visitors even more so. Slowly, he reached for the scalpel on the edge of his desk, clutching it tightly as he approached the door. When he opened it, a man in a crumpled lab coat stood on the other side, flanked by two armed soldiers. The man's face was gaunt, his sunken eyes scanning Elias with a mix of desperation and authority. "Dr. Grayson?" the man asked. Elias nodded. "I'm Dr. Kessler," the man said. "We need to talk, now." Kessler didn't waste time with pleasantries. The soldiers stayed outside, their rifles aimed at the empty hallway, while Kessler spread a series of classified documents across Elias's desk. The papers were stamped with the insignia of NASA, along with an acronym Elias didn't recognize. "This is everything we were able to recover before the station fell," Kessler said, his voice low and hurried. "Most of it was destroyed in the crash, but these survived." Elias scanned the documents, his eyes widening as the pieces began to fall into place. Photos of Enceladus filled the pages, vast ice fields, fissures, and the plumes of water vapor that had first drawn scientists to the moon. One photo showed a drill embedded deep within the ice, its metal frame coated in frost. Another showed the translucent sacs that Elias now knew all too well. They retrieved it from beneath the ice, Kessler said, pacing the room. Buried miles deep in a frozen lake, it was dormant for millions of years, maybe longer. The station was supposed to keep it in microgravity, where it couldn't interact with Earth's biosphere. But something went wrong. One of the samples began to show signs of activity, pulsing like it was alive. Elias frowned. How did they not anticipate this? Something this dangerous. There must have been protocols. Kessler laughed bitterly. There were. The protocols assumed it was a simple microbe, not this. By the time the researchers realized what they were dealing with, it was too late. The organism isn't a virus or a bacterium or even a parasite. It's something else entirely. What do you mean? Kessler leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a whisper. It doesn't just infect. It assimilates. It rewrites the host at a cellular level, transforming them into a new form of life. But that's not the worst part. Elias's chest tightened. What is? The organism is intelligent, Kessler said. Every infected host is part of a collective mind. The more it spreads, the smarter it gets. The hive is evolving, adapting. We thought it was contained in the lab, but it used the researchers. It made them sabotage the station. It wanted to come here. The words hit Elias like a blow. He sank into his chair, his mind racing. If Kessler was right, this wasn't just an outbreak. It was an invasion. Why Earth? Elias asked. Why now? Kessler shook his head. We don't know. Maybe it sensed the potential here. Billions of hosts to assimilate, to expand its network. Maybe it was an accident. Either way, it's here, and it's spreading faster than we can contain it. Elias stared at the documents, his hands tightening into fists. The photos, the reports, the logs from the ISS, all of it painted a picture of a life form so alien that it defied comprehension. It didn't just kill its hosts, it consumed them, repurposing their flesh and minds into something unrecognizable. The infected were no longer human, but they weren't fully alien either. They were something in between, a grotesque hybrid that seemed to serve only the hive's unfathomable goals. A faint ringing began in Elias's ears. He shook his head, trying to focus, but the sound grew louder. For a moment, he thought it was coming from the facility's alarms, but then he realized it wasn't external. It was inside his head. They're here, Kessler whispered, his face pale. Before Elias could respond, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of emergency exit signs. Outside the door, the soldiers shouted, their voices tinged with panic. The unmistakable sound of gunfire echoed through the halls, followed by wet, guttural screams. Kessler grabbed Elias by the arm. We have to move, now. Elias grabbed his notebook and the files, shoving them into his bag. As they stepped into the hallway, he saw one of the soldiers lying in a pool of blood, his body twitching. A black vine-like tendril slithered out of his mouth, dragging itself across the floor. Elias recoiled as the tendril froze mid-motion, its tip rising like a snake sensing prey. For a brief, horrifying moment, it turned toward him, its translucent surface pulsing with an inner light. Kessler yanked him forward. Don't stop. Keep moving. They ran through the facility, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. The infected were faster now, more coordinated. They moved as one, their distorted bodies bounding through the corridors with an unnatural grace. Elias risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The sight was too much. Dozens of figures, their flesh warped and glistening with black ichor, eyes glowing with the faint, unholy light of the hive. By the time they reached the exit, Elias's legs burned with exhaustion. The night air hit him like a slap, but there was no time to rest. A military transport truck waited just beyond the fence, its engine rumbling. Kessler shoved him inside, slamming the door as the driver floored the gas. As the facility receded into the distance, Elias stared out the back window. The infected stood at the perimeter, watching in eerie silence. Their glowing eyes followed the truck until it disappeared into the night. "They're learning," Kessler muttered. "They know we're trying to stop them." Elias didn't respond. His thoughts were already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of what he'd learned. The hive was intelligent. It was spreading, and it wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. But the most terrifying thought of all came unbidden, like a whisper from the back of his mind. What if it's already inside me? The city was no longer a city. Elias stood at the edge of what had once been the bustling downtown core, now swallowed by a writhing, pulsating nightmare. The ground beneath his feet was no longer asphalt, but a webbed, organic surface that twitched as though alive. Tendrils of black, glistening tissue snaked across crumbled buildings, their veins pulsing with an eerie, bioluminescent glow. The air was thick with spores, floating in shimmering clouds that sparkled like ash from a distant fire. It was beautiful in a way that made Elias's skin crawl, a grotesque elegance that defied logic or comprehension. The hive was awake now, fully formed. What had started as a handful of infected had grown into a vast, sentient network of flesh and thought, stretching miles in every direction. At its center, towering above the ruins, was the core, a pulsating mass of fused bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and ecstasy, mouths stretched open in silent screams. It loomed over the city like a cathedral to some ancient alien god. Elias adjusted the device strapped to his chest, a small, jury-rigged dispersal system containing the isotope compound he had developed. It wasn't perfect. He hadn't had time to test it fully, but it was his only chance. The compound would destabilize the hive's cellular structure, breaking the connections between hosts and severing its collective mind. But to work, he needed to release it directly into the core. He glanced at the timer on the device. 20 minutes. The hive knew he was there. The infected emerged from the shadows as he stepped deeper into the city, their movements eerily synchronized. They watched him with glowing, fractured eyes, their heads tilting in unison as if considering him. Their bodies, once human, were now grotesque amalgamations of alien biology. Spines elongated, limbs twisted into barbed appendages, mouths bristling with teeth that seemed to grow and retract at will. But they didn't attack. Not yet. They were waiting, their collective intelligence calculating. Elias kept walking. His every step was deliberate, each one taking him closer to the core. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing shallow beneath the mask he wore to filter the spores. He could feel the hive's presence now, not just in the environment, but in his mind. A faint whisper at the edge of his consciousness, growing louder with each step. Why resist? The voice was soft, seductive. It wasn't a voice at all, but a thought that wasn't his own. You could be part of something greater. He clenched his fists, shaking his head to clear the invasive thoughts. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice muffled by the mask. "This isn't your world. It was never yours." The final stretch to the core was the hardest. The organic terrain became unstable, shifting beneath his feet as though trying to swallow him. The whispers in his mind turned into screams, angry, desperate, pleading. The hive wasn't just a mind, it was a billion minds all fused into one, and it knew fear. When Elias reached the base of the core, he froze. Up close, it was worse than he had imagined. The mass was an intricate lattice of bodies and alien tissue, spiraling upward like a grotesque tower. Faces stared out at him from the flesh, their eyes filled with the dim glow of the hive's consciousness. Some of them he recognized, colleagues, nurses, patients from the hospital. Their mouths moved soundlessly as if trying to speak, but only the hive's voice came through. "You cannot destroy us. We are infinite. We are the next step." Elias ignored the voice. His hands trembled as he activated the dispersal device, the timer ticking down from 5 minutes. He strapped it to the base of the core, securing it in place with shaking fingers. The hive reacted immediately. The ground beneath him convulsed and the infected surged forward, no longer content to observe. They came from all sides, a tide of grotesque, writhing bodies. Elias pulled the revolver from his belt, firing wildly as he backed away from the core. The gunshots echoed through the alien cathedral, each one finding its mark, but it wasn't enough. For every infected that fell, another took its place, their movements fluid and relentless. One tackled him, its barbed arms pinning him to the ground. Elias screamed as the creature's face loomed over him, its fractured pupils glowing with malicious intent. But before it could strike, a sudden convulsion rippled through its body. It spasmed violently, then collapsed, its flesh dissolving into a puddle of black ichor. Elias pushed himself to his feet, his gaze snapping to the core. The dispersal device was working. The compound had begun to spread, seeping into the hive structure. The faces in the core twisted in agony, their glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. "No!" the hive screamed, its voice now a cacophony of rage and despair. "You will become, you cannot stop us." The infected around him collapsed one by one, their bodies dissolving into formless heaps of flesh. The ground beneath his feet began to quake, the entire hive convulsing as the compound tore through its network. Elias staggered, his vision blurring as the spores in the air thickened. He fell to his knees, coughing violently as the whispers in his mind grew deafening. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," the hive bellowed, its voice now desperate, fraying at the edges. "You are already part of us." Elias glanced at his arm, where faint black veins were beginning to creep beneath his skin. He had known this would happen. The spores had been in his system for days, maybe longer. Even if he succeeded, he wouldn't survive, but that didn't matter. With the last of his strength, he stood, turning to face the core. The device's timer flashed, 10 seconds. He smiled bitterly, his vision dimming as he whispered, "Not today." The explosion was blinding. A wave of white-hot light engulfed the core, disintegrating it in an instant. The shockwave rippled outward, consuming the infected and obliterating the hive's physical form. Elias felt the light wash over him, burning away the whispers, the fear, the pain. When the dust settled, the city was silent. The hive was gone, its tendrils reduced to ash, its core obliterated. In the ruins, amidst the smoldering remains, a figure emerged. Elias stumbled forward, his body broken but somehow still moving. His skin glowed faintly now, veins of bioluminescent light pulsing beneath the surface. The hive was dead, but something lingered inside him. A fragment, a memory, a seed. As he walked into the empty streets, he looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter now, their light untainted. But in his mind, something stirred, a faint whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. This is only the beginning. And then there was silence.